Okay, we're near the end of the course, but we've got a couple of open sessions on the syllabus where we can have, first of all, student presentations if we have any student papers, ideas. Second, we can have some student discussion on some of these topics. For instance, we might take diversity and have a couple of you maybe lead discussion on what you've read about diversity in more popular, more current general media in the last couple of years. This is so hot. And then ways that we can address them a little more coherently based on what we've read in this course. Third, we've got some material on the Bronzeville Welcoming Center as a policy option to deal with issues of racism and changing African-American images and self-images in battles among African-Americans with themselves as well as with others. And then issues of race and crime, I'll talk a little bit about today. But in brief, I'm here to check with you, first of all, do we have any people who have a paper that you're doing for another course that relates to something you'd want to present here, or an BA and MA in progress? And is it Alex, you there? Alex Rubio?
Yes.
Yeah, do you have the paper? Have I got the right Alex? Can I see your face a second?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, no, it's a different Alex.
Okay, perfect.
Do you have a, okay, so the general question is, does anyone have a paper? We know the other Alex has an MA thesis on diversity, social movements, and the like. He hasn't really presented his specifics, but that's an option, for instance. Anyone else? This Alex, do you have anything that you might want to present?
Possibly. I'm currently working on my BA thesis, but I don't know yet.
Just tell us, give us one or 2 minutes about it, just to give a flavor, please.
Sure, yeah. My BA thesis is about analyzing the politics of Bolivia, in terms of like looking at how populist rhetoric increased following the discovery of gas reserves in indigenous territories. So specifically, what my thesis is looking at is the intersection of politics and resources and how that is viewed in the Latin American context.
Okay, now that sounds great. Yeah, how about some kind of presentation on that? Let's look and see if we have others, and then based on how many we get, we can see how much time and how to handle them. But let me get a blank sheet of paper, and Sharon, maybe you can do the same. And so we've got Alex Rubio, Bolivia, populist politics and resources. Okay. Anybody else? Don't be modest. It doesn't have to be a BA. It can be something that you've simply been engaged with, even in a policy advocacy activist manner, and you'd like to have sort of a way of have a little discussion of that with, say, someone else who's been doing that, either insights that you've gained from the activist meetings you've gone to, the activities you've been engaged in, the website kinds of postings, any of that, and try to connect some of that sort of activity with themes in the course, or see how they do or don't seem to connect. Anybody else who want to mention something like that or participate in something like that? Okay, well, think about it, and we'll see if anyone else has a topic of that sort. And if you have other suggestions or themes that, such as the ones I mentioned, or variations of them, you want to have us explore, these we have time to do so. Okay, let me, with that background, ask if anyone else has any other more general questions about the course or readings or whatever that is. We have one section left basically on the syllabus, which has a couple of subheads, including ethnicity, global and local cultures, how the decline and of the welfare state and the rise of civil society varies. No. I'm sorry, I'm a session off here. Well, basically, it's ethnicity and race are the and let's call it one big theme added by Joseph He is cosmopolitan, and another, the most current label now, is diversity. So these are the topics that are overlapping in what I want to help us think about and discuss, and then bring in some specific neighborhoods in Chicago, some international examples like Bolivia, in ways that we can see, we can understand ourselves and neighborhoods nearby better by seeing how some of these things get carried further, how populism in Bolivia may go further than Trump, etc. Okay. Anything else on that? All right, let me. I've said we are periodically using some cases. France, China, US, and some cases of individual leaders who typify some more general patterns. We talked about populist, Alex mentioned populist politics, and these include Donald Trump, who broke with the visible Republican leadership by finding emotional counters to Clinton, first labeling some Mexicans as rapists, then proposing a stop to immigrations by Muslims until the jihadist terrorism declines. Note that these new externally perceived threats to America and avoid the classic black-white divide. Second, the ISIS rhetoric and name claims to be Muslim, but obviously constructs its own highly distinctive combination of social conservatism, and especially for women's roles and strong ethnic conflict in warlike manner in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, such as targeting small groups of Christians and others they disagree with. The third is, of course, Hillary Clinton. And how does ethnicity connect to each of these is what I'm pointing out. If we think of these, how do each of these broader ideological activist perspectives reframe, reuse, re-engage, or try to with ethnicity, qua culture, or labeling it as something else. Hillary Clinton continues generally the main Democratic Party social liberalism, of tolerance and assimilation, welcoming of multiple ethnic groups and immigrants. And she had stronger support in the states and cities with more minority, especially women voters. And of course, Biden has broadly continued this, but with some interesting twists in various ways that we pointed out, like the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, the fourth theme, the fourth group, in a sense, are the anti-police confrontations of African Americans, seen perhaps the most, which seems perhaps the most complex because we have more data and more years of social science and historical analysis of the roots of these patterns of African Americans. Some patterns are distinctly local, while others, I have a little bit of soup here for my throat. Some of these seem distinctly local. Others are heightened by linkage to strong national movement in the model of the civil rights movement dynamics, combined with Martin Luther King, combined with talk shows and mobile leaders that travel from city to city. This was done by Jesse Jackson, by Dorothy Tillman, and their younger counterparts from the 60s and 70s onward. And of course, how is this happening today? BLM. The Black Lives Matter variation builds on this and other examples, but adds a more activist, more militant kind of rhetoric for some of this. And a rhetoric which reframes a number of the issues away from, clearly, most visibly, the main goal, explicit goal of Martin Luther King, which was what? Racial assimilation. The goal of the civil rights movement was to give African Americans and other minorities the same legal rights as whites, basically. That changed dramatically, of course, with the rise of Black power. So where and how these kinds of new themes get added, Black power, and then updated in turn with social media, the murders of African Americans by the police, which gave the name to Black Lives Matter. But the narrow specific focus on the police in specific cities was a theme in the civil rights movement. It was, I would say it was more a tactic, whereas it has become a more general ideological touchstone for broader discussions of racism in American society and or third world global societies in subsequent years. Okay, let's examine some of this. Many discussions focus on contemporary patterns such as higher crime rates of young African American men, high incarceration rates, disenfranchisement as a consequence, neighborhood segregation, and the like. Remember the rise of egalitarianism, especially after 1968. Okay, you all know that. But how can we add a little more specifics which can inform why is Chicago so high in its distinctive crime rate in the last few years? It was not. Chicago, New York, and LA were about the same, maybe 10 years or so ago. And I'll just mention, I'm drawing here on, I'm not doing original research on this, but I'm drawing on conferences I've been to and some interesting big findings, such as crime rates in the world have gone down from about the 14th century. That is 1500, 1500 in places like Venice, Florence, Paris. Proper women would never go out without an armed guard. They would stay inside walled houses. Castles were built for serious reasons. So in the longer term, we see less and less violence. On the other hand, even in the 1400s, in the Netherlands, as I've mentioned, as Gorski's book details, crime rates were minimal. Women walked alone at night in the Netherlands at the same time that Columbus was discovering America. This was a huge difference from Southern Europe. So something about Protestantism, or especially, not general all Protestantism, but especially those aspects which happen to be as well identified by Max Weber as evangelical, distinctive Calvinist Protestantism, historically brought some major differences with it. Okay, in that context, crime in the US has been going up or down since the time of the Civil Rights Movement, 1960s. And roughly how much? It's been going down a lot. Why did it go down? And then why do we get the differences by cities, and why is Chicago going up now? These are, we mentioned some individual cities to look for broader patterns. And I'm making these points here because I'm amazed at how little the general press, the general discussions of this bring out the points I want to make in the next few minutes. And yet how important they are, and how much they're not just vague, abstract labels like Black power or white racism. One of the most recent important urban policies which changed these patterns by city was the so-called broken windows theory of James Q. Wilson, political scientist at Chicago and Harvard. It was first implemented seriously by the Boston police superintendent, as he was nearby Harvard, named Bratton, B-R-A-T-T-O-N. Sharon, could you see if you can find a photo or two of Bratton? I have one right here, but if you've got an easy one you can bring up, we can just show there's a picture of him smiling, which I've got, or anything, one or two things on broken windows, just to give a flavor of how much it's gotten big attention to a small audience. Bratton lowered the crime rate so much in Boston that he was appointed superintendent of police under Mayor Giuliani in New York, who wanted a generally tough on crime approach on street vendors and was insensitive to protests about racism by the police and the mayor, compared to many other cities at the same time. Crime studies are continuing, but the simple publicized result was that crime dropped dramatically in New York, apparently faster than in other locations across the US. And Bratton and others claimed credit for the broken windows theory and for their policies, which reduced crime, they claimed. The theory and the policies became much more popular across the US. The term, who can tell us what the term broken windows refers to in the basic idea of the theory? Anybody? The idea is analogous to what we discuss as a scene. That is, if you have an area where crime rates are high, not just a whole neighborhood, but something like an entrance to a subway or an exit from a subway, that may be surrounded by people, things, street vendors, people who may be drunk, people who may be selling liquor, but also there may be nearby shops where the windows are broken. The idea of Wilson is to change the scene surrounding the subway entrance, fix the broken windows, maybe have police or somehow change the open violation of the law in ways that could be then generalized to others in New York City or Boston or other cities. This became very popular with police departments across the whole US in these years. Many local departments at least talked about it, and a fair number of them adopted it in various ways. The most visible case was the hiring by the city of Los Angeles, away from New York, of Bratton himself. So Bratton became not only police chief in Boston, New York, then Los Angeles. Then he went back to New York, getting more and more publicity with about these theories, which were studied. For example, one of the most detailed was several years of ethnographic research by our sociology colleague here, Forrest Stewart. He began his field work for his PhD a year before Bratton arrived in LA and implemented his policies. So Forrest Stewart, in talking to folks in one of the highest homeless crime rates of Los Angeles, he observed on the street level how the scene drastically changed. That is, before Bratton, there were very few police who ever went through the neighborhood at all, mostly when they were called. But the streets were filled, that is, there were lots of people standing around in the streets, selling things, talking to each other, even exercising, doing weightlifting in the streets, which Forrest would do with other people. After Bratton arrived, the police made a dramatically visible presence by walking through the neighborhood several times a day, many policemen together, stopping inconsistently, not everybody necessarily, but stopping many, many people and asking for identification, background information from most anyone who was standing in the street. This quickly led to the disappearance of prostitutes and drug dealers, but also many others who may have been stopped or somehow had a dealing with the police so that they had a, quote, record of some sort. And they didn't want that to be brought out by being stopped in the street and having their identification asked for. So the streets became much less filled with people. Looking at more aggregate data on crime, numbers of jailed persons the dramatic results have been decreases, especially in these high crime neighborhoods in New York and Los Angeles. But the critics stress the degree to which the scene culture of the police has been transformed into a scene of surveillance, domination, fearful control, rather than of tolerance. The Chicago culture traditionally, several people at Yale Law School have made these kinds of points. And there was a woman, okay, I won't mention, but they're a mixture of lawyers, sociologists, psychologists, police advocates of various sorts, and then the more general commentators who use this in social media. The Chicago culture, traditionally, by contrast, and for several decades, has been one of stressing neighborhood specificity, community culture grounded in distinctive and strong, visible ethnic groups. Here's our big topic, especially white Catholics like the Polish and the Irish, who were the Poles were this is the biggest city if you look at include Warsaw, Chicago's the biggest Polish city in the world, second biggest. Other cities in Poland, like Krakow, are smaller than Chicago in terms of the number of Polish background resident persons. So the white Catholics gave the Chicago political system its cultural style, especially the Irish. The Irish often as the leaders, the most active and least successful as mayor, as city council member, and especially ward committeeman in the party. But the numbers were larger for the Poles. And these in turn tended to link with many white Catholics in a style that took more shape over the period from especially 1933, but ethnic politics was the center of Chicago politics for the whole 20th century. The police policy counterpart was not to deny these neighborhood ethnic specificities, but to try to collaborate with them to build community groups in the form of the most famous example were called CAPS, Community Alternative Policing Strategy. That is, these would be often monthly meetings where the police would meet publicly with anyone who wanted to come, usually from the neighborhood, and especially neighborhood activists would be there, and they would report problems. That say there's a liquor store that's been it's been open later than it's legal to do so. There are people who stand outside, they're selling drugs, close them down. And so that sort of thing would be discussed, or they would send in at least police to explore it further. This is not part of the broken window strategy. It's an alternative instead of the broken windows. And so this kind of CAPS community alternative was visibly seen as a better way to build on the neighborhood and ethnic strong traditions, which were distinctly and have been long distinctly powerful here in Chicago. This neighborhood tradition, however, has been undercut by the reform program, starting especially with Daley #2, but then growing much stronger with Mayor Rahm Emanuel, especially concerning service delivery of police and schools. So we now have a nationally publicized school crisis in Chicago, illustrating exactly the lack of neighborhood civic leaders and the lack of support which they received from Rahm Emanuel when he was mayor. Indeed, the chief opponents to Rahm Emanuel were teachers and the head of and the police unions, and sometimes the teachers union head was considered as a candidate to run for mayor herself, but she fell ill and they did not try. The head of the police union in Chicago wrote to President Trump and said, the city is out of control. Send the National Guard or whatever. When Lori Lightfoot at that point was mayor. Lightfoot, of course, following a series of complicated policies I won't try to summarize, except to say that she used the same label that came from the early 20th century of reform, fighting against the traditional machine. So if machine reform is one classic big theme differentiating not only American cities, but the same thing you find in China and France and elsewhere. These are elements, these are byproducts in a sense of how these broader themes can work out in sometimes ironic and unanticipated ways. These combine, of course, in being, in Chicago being what is labeled in the press regularly as the most segregated large city in the US, measured usually by black, white, or non-white neighborhoods in certain kinds of proximity measures. But basically you have big black neighborhoods, which you don't, big specifically Mexican neighborhoods, and in the past, Polish neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods. But those have been explicitly, especially in the cases of Daley 2 and Rahm Emanuel, they sought to draw votes from those different ethnic neighborhoods, not just having the Daley 1 kind of strategy, which was white Catholics against the blacks and the others. Daley 2 wanted to build a black organization which would vote for him, and he succeeded. And so there were substantial numbers of voters of African Americans who supported Daley 2 and then Rahm Emanuel. Okay, and the label was reform, which attracted many of them. Not to say that they were always successful or were actual reformers, but the label, the culture, the framing of reform is a critical part of this nationally, internationally, and neighborhood specific here. Why is this? What's distinctive about the African American here, sir? Let me check with Sharon. Were you able to find anything on Bratton picture, or any headlines or anything?
How do you spell Bratton?
Okay, B-R-A-T-T-E-N. Okay, check on, keep on checking if you find something, but
what kind of stuff do you expect? You mean pictures, news media coverage, or
a picture or video? If we have a little video of something you see, that would be fine. Okay. Maybe screen it first if it looks. I mean, like 30 seconds is fine.
Okay.
I know I'm asking at the last minute, so I apologize. If we don't find something, we'll skip it. Why the distinctive African-American culture of neighborhoods? The cultures of crime and deviance have been repeatedly described in these neighborhoods for decades. And it has been attributed in part to the lack of police engagement. That is, the police simply did not patrol as much in many Black neighborhoods. That is leaving individuals more on their own to deal with gangs, with shootings, with retribution, revenge, which has the consequence of undermining trust in individuals, in civic leaders, and in political leaders. Trust is much lower among African Americans than others in the US. The increasing police presence, such as brought by the broken windows theory in New York and LA, thus was a dramatic change away from leaving Black neighborhoods to themselves, which is what Forrest Stewart documented with his ethnography. Just prostitution, drugs, you can go there, or in, of course, in Bronzeville in the 1920s and 30s, whites came from the north side, from the Loop, from other parts of Chicago, the suburbs. They'd drive to Bronzeville because you could buy and sell liquor, take it home. You could go to clubs, you could go to dances, you could hear Louis Armstrong playing. And these kinds of things were tolerated, probably with substantial cash payoffs from the gangsters and people who owned some of those clubs to the Chicago police and probably the mayor, the Republican mayor at the time, Thompson. This, of course, reversed with the broken windows theory and with Bratton. And then behind and after that, Rahm Emanuel, which led to much more resentment by African Americans, and said, we're now being targeted. That is, some critics of this increased police presence would say, we're being targeted, and this is a racist policy, and it's raising crime. Okay, lots of rhetoric. One of the few serious specific studies of some of this was by Peter Rossi, three sociologists, Burke and Eidson, E-I-D-S-O-N, but Peter Rossi was the lead faculty member here. The book was called The Roots of Urban Discontent. And it studied 10 cities. Initially, at the beginning, there were 5 cities that had no riots, race-informed riots in the late 60s, and 5 cities that had that some that did, some that did not, 5 and 5 roughly. By the end of the time period when they were still doing their research, all 10 had had some kinds of riots, but they were nevertheless quite different. And that's the interesting part of the book. Because unlike most studies which use one method, like an ethnography of Forrest Stewart or a national survey of all African Americans, which does not tell you which neighborhoods, which cities are they in, this book combined city specificity and survey research and ethnography, and it mixed them together with some very powerful results. That is, the dramatic finding was, okay, so second, they surveyed not only the citizens, mostly Black, they also surveyed the police, grocery store merchants, who they asked, how often might other grocery store merchants slightly weight the scales and make the customers pay more money than they really should, because they weighted the scales. I mean, that is, we're looking at actions done by the providers of service in African American neighborhoods. The police were asked, how often do the police, or how often do you beat up people over the head or use your sticks? And social workers, I think, were a third kind of group. Did they find that those neighborhoods in those cities where the merchants said the merchants themselves said, yes, many merchants here in Gary or here in New York or here in Detroit, they do press down the scales and they make Black people pay more money than white people. Or did those cities where the police more often said, yeah, I beat them up a lot. Gary, for example, has 4 times the murder rate, or did a few years ago, 4 times the murder rate of Chicago. Bogota, Colombia has had 6 times the murder rate when I went there. I mean, the mayor Bogota invited us because he had a big conference for all the mayors of the big cities in Colombia. And he wanted to have some discussion of clientelism and how much clientelism and gangsters and payoffs were really creating or solving some specific policies. So this study is an example of the kind of trying to bring serious research to this. And what was the main thing which explained the difference between the 10 cities in terms of their reported police violence by the African-American citizens? Question. Okay, that is the intuitive answer, of course. Those places where they got beaten up more must have felt the police are more violent and we get beaten up more. And we're discriminated against by the merchant because they charge us more. The social workers don't give us as good treatment as whites. No, none of those really made a substantial difference. What made a bigger difference than those actual service deliveries, which are frequently discussed in the rhetoric? What was more important? Having a Black mayor. Those cities with a Black mayor said, no, the police are not violent here in Gary. We have a Black mayor. Even though they had 4 times the murder rate of Chicago, etc. Okay. Especially the first Black mayor would generate a whirl in the 60s and 70s in places like Detroit and Gary. And they visibly appointed police leaders to be more responsive to Black citizens. And of course, this happened again about 2, 3, 4 years ago with the mayors of Atlanta, Chicago, New York, and LA. Those 4 big cities had, and those 4 cities then adopted, and the police their funding was cut. They were cut back in a variety of ways. They were rhetorically attacked by the mayors in those cities in ways that linked with the Black Lives Matter rhetoric. So the police became labeled as major sources of the problem in ways that had not been true at all to the extent this was the case earlier. But this kind of foundation had been laid earlier. Find anything, Sharon?
Yeah. Shall I share the screen?
You say yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Why don't you go ahead and share the screen. Show us a little bit.
This is CBS News.
Is there any? Yeah. Before you show it, you need to click on. Back up. Back up. You need to click on that box in the lower left on your screen to get the sound to work right.
He's having a good time for himself, but in the meantime, I don't know about you, but he's annoying the hell out of me.
Bratton, who led police departments in Los Angeles, Boston, and twice in New York.
Can you guys hear the sound of the video?
Yeah, that's excellent.
Hey, fellas.
Stops to chat with a couple of officers.
Met before, have we not?
Did you get my speech actually for the academy graduation? You say that cop is the face of the government, it's the face of the state.
It's the most visible, and the one that has probably the most power of any individual in government is that cop on the street.
They're walking the beat, just as he did more than a half a century ago. Much has changed, but not everything.
I would argue being a cop today in America is tougher than probably any other time going back to the early 70s. They're feeling not appreciated. It's a frustrating time for them. So many of them are leaving the profession.
That's not all that troubles him. Bratton is one of the leading architects of modern policing, whose reforms and innovative approaches lowered crime and, he says, bolstered the bond between the public and the men and women who serve and protect.
The changes in the profession over the years, the reforms, have been phenomenal, but it's as if for 50 years we were doing nothing, that we're just marking time. And that's my frustration.
In his new book, The Profession, Bratton fears much of what he helped create is crumbling.
We have a national crisis. We have 50 states, 3,600 counties, God knows how many cities and towns. We have 18,000 police forces. And we have, unlike many other democracies, we have very few national guidelines.
There were even fewer when Bratton was a kid in the white, working-class Boston neighborhood of Dorchester. At 9 years old, he was already dreaming of a life in law enforcement.
This is Your Police, which is the book I checked out of the Boston Public Library every chance I got.
He joined the force in 1970.
Patrolman, badge 1190.
Bratton says a problem then is still a problem now, a lack of preparation.
My training was about 6 to 7 weeks before I was given a gun and a blue uniform put out in the street. Yeah. But the training now should really, I think, be expanded to a minimum of a year. That just think of the power that we're putting into the hands of a young man or woman, the power to take a life.
Bratton quickly rose through the ranks, becoming commissioner in 1993, when he embraced the concept of community policing.
The American police, working as partners with American citizens and the government, will get the job done.
It's three P's. It's very easy to understand. Partnership, work with the community. 2, the problems of the community, big and small. And 3, what is the goal? Prevention. Deal with it in a way you solve the problem so it goes away.
I, William Bratton.
I, William Bratton.
Do solemnly swear.
A year later, Mayor Rudy Giuliani lured him away to stem the crime wave sweeping New York.
Very tough to work for. Very Machiavellian in many respects. But whether you like him or not, he did change the city for the better in many respects in the sense that he made it safe.
Bratton says broken windows policing, cracking down on quality of life offenses, and CompStat, a computerized crime tracking system, all played a part. The turnaround landed him on the cover of Time magazine. His boss wasn't happy.
And the person that was doing the story wanted the photo. And he said, we have the opportunity to do it with just you, or you can ask the mayor. And I thought about 3 seconds and said, let's do it just me. And so it ended up becoming
you knew
Time
you were
magazine.
doing that.
This was basically going to be my exit song.
I want to talk very bluntly to you. The citizens of this city need you back in those streets.
In 2002, he was appointed chief of police in LA, a department plagued by racism and brutality. While there, he met a black community organizer named Alice Harris, known as Sweet Alice.
She really helped me to understand so many of the black issues in LA. And she says to me, Chief, you know why we like you so much? And I said, no, Sweet Alice, why is that? You see us. You really see us. That's the highest accolade I've ever received.
So that's a great story, but why do so many Black Americans not feel seen by the police?
Because they're not. They really are not.
Bratton returned to New York in 2014.
We will all work hard to identify why is it that so many in this city do not feel good about this department that has done so much to make them safe.
6 months after he was sworn in, an officer put a fatal chokehold on Eric Garner, an unarmed black man selling loose cigarettes outside a Staten Island storefront.
This is a memorial that's been put up in memory of Eric Garner. May his soul rest in peace.
Garner is saying, I can't breathe, 11 times.
11 times. The idea of trying to take him down, just the two of them, and both of them were smaller than Garner was very, very big. And effectively, it was just a bad tactic, and it ended up in a
So-
terrible tragedy.
Garner was selling loose cigarettes, which wasn't legal. He was a big black man, but that didn't mean he deserved to die.
Oh, correctly. In terms of George Floyd didn't, so often in these struggles that, particularly over minor events, such as the sale of loosies, nobody deserves to die at the hands of the police, but it happens 1,000 times a year.
Along with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Garner's death sparked nationwide protests, fueling the Black Lives Matter movement that was reignited again last year with the murder of George Floyd.
I have a mantra: cops count, police matter. The individual action of a cop, the collective action of the police matter. So Derek Chauvin's actions as an individual cop, look at the significance of that action. He did so much damage to the American police profession, unrivaled, damage to the profession around the world.
Bratton supports many reforms that have been called for since Chauvin's murder of Floyd, including mandatory police body cameras and limits on qualified immunity, which protects police from criminal charges if they use deadly force in the line of duty. But he rejects the most radical buzzword.
It's one of the reasons I'm so frustrated with the hashtag defund the police. You need to refund the police. What I'm hoping coming out of this bill in Congress, the George Floyd bill, when it comes out, is that it will effectively force government.
Okay, all right, that's excellent. If we can maybe send me and the others a link to that. I've not seen this before, but to have it come up to present and have Bratton himself take a position on the more recent events is great. Obviously, self-centered, partisan, but an important part and an important major policy player. So showing that many policies are not just an abstraction, but they change with specific people, and mayors choosing to embrace or ignore a particular policy. So the anti-Bratton policies of the last New York mayor have been really changed, or at least are in the process of being changed in New York right now, which elected a former police officer as the mayor. Okay, let me add one great thing about Chicago is that these issues are so frankly and openly discussed that I can and have invited many aldermen, policemen, and others to class and use their one-liners like, who's invited to a party of the aldermen? Quote, not invited unless indicted. This distinguishes the leadership here, combined with the fact that 38 aldermen have been indicted in the last 20 years or so of the 50 aldermen in the Chicago City Council. See the book and the website of Dick Simpson at UIC, where he's got lots of this and he monitors this on a continuing basis. We gave a course together last fall, taught by 20 or so persons who work on these issues at all the universities and some policy centers, think tanks in the Chicago area. Where do these patterns come from? I'll just briefly mention, well, I'll drop that. I'm mentioning localism versus cosmopolitanism, and the bigger dimensions, the bigger cultural dimensions that inform these outlooks, which in Chicago are different from other cities. Ethnicity is a byproduct of this, or part of this. They make the point briefly that some of the recent confrontations have been heightened by the decline in traditional racism, which excluded all Blacks from areas like the Chicago North Side. The closing of clubs on the South Side, where there used to be more than 52, today have only 1 or 2. So Saturday and Friday night in my neighborhood, young folks go to the North Side. They go to clubs, they dance, they sing, they cheer. It depends on the music being performed in each club. And so on Friday, it may be more Mexican, or it may be one particular kind of house music, or it may be a music which will attract, in the case of house, more gays as well as African Americans and Mexicans. Others, the gang music, very different still. These cultural meanings have become critical parts of nighttime travel. This in turn has led to the musicians themselves and the audiences going to neighborhoods which they previously did not go to. So two, the last 20 years of the broken windows policies and the expansion of police into the lower status African-American neighborhoods, trying to make the provision of service more equal, as in the case documented in LA by Forrest Stewart. Third, the historical emergence of distinctive political cultures and the migration of these with African Americans into northern cities and west outside the South. These conflicts arise over these more general cultures and specific policies and preferences. I'll document this shortly. Okay.
Professor,
yes.
Luke Downing has a question in the chat section. Would you please?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to let me get through a little bit more, and then we'll have some more general discussion.
Okay, thank you.
I just got a couple of things I want to try to feature myself here. Let me just click this share sound. I don't think I have any sound. Okay. You see that the normal story? Media images of poor Black neighborhoods, more crime, bad health, obesity, dangerous lifestyles. Social scientists also talk about race, class, gender, and national origin, explain these variables and more. The normal, you've heard it in many classes. Examples here, Heat Wave, book by sociologist, Chicago born and raised, Eric Kleinenberg. Over 700 people died in Chicago in July 1995. The Latino Little Village neighborhood had a much lower death rate than the same the African-American North Lawndale. Affluent areas had low death rates. A play has been made, and this is of course the politically correct story, which we all know. What's wrong? Here's the map of the normal story that you've seen in hundreds of forms and used to be on in many of the classrooms in the social science building. It showed the different wards or Chicago community areas defined by sociologists, and they would then show things like crime rates. And those dark red, reddish brown areas were, of course, higher in crime on the south side and the west side. Beyond this, what's wrong with those maps and that thinking? Selective attention by the media and most commentators who do not point out that most US Blacks are not poor and most poor are not Black. About 3/4 of each of these are not. Second, overstating weak relationships, correlations, race, income, gender, national origin with loneliness, overall health are significant often, but they're clearly not deterministic. You've heard me say many times, roughly 80% of the variance of things like crime is not explained by these primordial characteristics. How often you hear this? Most complex systems are multi-causal. Spuriousness, omitting critical variables. And think about this if you're doing a BA on Bolivia. Ask what you may or may not have been able to capture. Papers by the two of these folks and with students here, and take the findings of Kleinenberg. They look at crime and the deaths from the heat wave by separate neighborhoods, but they looked not just at 2 cases, they looked at all the neighborhoods, not just the neighborhoods in the map, but they also added more variables. They did multiple regressions, adding things beyond ethnicity. The dramatic result was that in some of their models, Blacks and Hispanic effects fell to 0, insignificant, and more important were grocery stores, drugstores, banks, and other local nearby retail. These draw people out of their homes, so others in the same neighborhoods, and this reduces crime. Geographic scale. Class, race, and gender be less deterministic if we go to smaller geographic units. So the highest crime concentrations are immediately surrounded the L stops. Subways, elevated trains have all-night liquor stores. Just a few blocks away, we find in Bronzeville, where I live, has a crime rate the same as Lincoln Park. Okay, here's 2001. High crime rates right along these subway routes, L it's called here. And then crossing over south, here's the University of Chicago. How about right next to the campus, or where I live up here in Bronzeville? It's the same as Lincoln Park. Oh, we don't have high crime rates in University of Chicago campus? That can't be true. 2001, 10 years later, the police paid attention to this broken windows, that is, or at least to the concentration near those entrances. They patrolled them more, and crime went way down at most of them, not entirely over here to south of the USC. So there are a couple of places, but that is this the normal image of the South and West sides? Black neighborhoods, high crime? No. Dangerous subway entrances, high crime. The causal model is totally different. Add context to the body of theories, not just X causes Y, but when C is low, the relation is very strong. But when C is context, specifying how the context shifts the key patterns is critical. Science begins with comparison, which heightens these contextual differences as they rise in importance as the primordial declines. Okay, let me just do a couple more. So we've seen some of this here: scenes, neighborhoods, and the kinds of resources that vary by these, and then examples of some dramatic scenes linked to political leadership. So in Italy, the president arrives and they have jets flying overhead. They have policemen on horses, et cetera, et cetera. In the Seoul beef protest, massive demonstrations against the president and others. You've seen this, you know this. Scenes approach, this we've been over. I just want to get to a little bit more, which links this to what I mentioned, the communitarian image that is This is 19th century Gemeinschaft. It's a score that we've generated now for every zip code in the US using our Scenescapes data. And basically what we see is the South and the small towns in the Midwest have got much more of a sense of we're friends, we know people, that they're rural in lifestyle. By contrast, California, north of California, New England, New York, Washington, these are urbane kinds of places. People do not value personal relationships to the same degree that they do in the South. And my neighbors pay attention to this. So if we find these 4 dimensions of self-expression, transgression, traditionalism, and neighborhood. So we find the neighborhood theatricality, the lower right, look at that. That's the South and the Midwest. And neighborliness is much less present in the kinds of retail things that I mentioned were found in the study of Chicago, and refuting essentially Eric Kleinenberg's case study of 2 neighborhoods. Here are examples of the four cities, or this is just LA and Chicago. So neighborliness is very high here on, is very high. I won't try to put my cursor on top of it. Neighborliness is very high on the South and West sides. Self-expression is very high in the Loop, and then further, but not in those Black areas. These are based more on surveys aggregated up, and they were done. This was then redone as not by us with scenes. These were done by psychologists. The psychologists now are using 5 dimensions of personality, and here are their names: extroverted, agreeable, neurotic, conscientious, open to experience. And you see the maps, basically the South has the extroverted and agreeable people. And the neurotic people are in New York, and the open to experience people are in New York and California, where they don't want masks to interrupt. So here's again by neighborhood. The agreeable people are in Bronzeville, my neighbors. Extroverted people are in, again, African-American, West Side and South Side. These are self-described. How would you describe yourself in the following 25 questions? This is a national survey that was done. And the data are now can go down to the zip code level like this. Neurotic. The North Siders are neurotic. Maybe the Hyde Parkers too. Okay. Then that glamour drives regression. Regression drives job growth. You've heard that already. But cross-nationally, Canada, Spain, Tokyo, Seoul, we have big differences. That is, the Asian and Latin American countries are more neighborly. Tokyo, Barcelona, Madrid, Paris are much more generally neighborly than New York, Chicago, LA, or traditional. So traditional, just to those. Specifically, if we then link this to politics, who is charismatic? Faber's idea of charisma links the leader with the follower. And how does charisma differ by neighborhood in New York, Chicago, and LA? And what is, so if we look on the far right, glamour and self-expression make you charismatic in LA and New York. Glamour, self-expression, the film reviews, the prizes, and so forth. By contrast, in Chicago, look at these. Chicago is high. If you're charismatic in Chicago as an alderman or a mayor, you should be egalitarian, neighborly, and localistic. So these are now completely different data from amenities found in these neighborhoods, which I'm showing have the same kind of pattern as the individual surveys and the self-expressive surveys, self-administered surveys, and that these kinds of data from totally different data sources match up and they tell a consistent story, which stresses more the and then just one or two last ones here, that this is now the US. What are the kinds of organizations that are critical in the US? Just the most numerous. If you take all organizations. In the US, what is it? By far, religious organizations. 70% of all US organizations are religious. Look at it in France. Religious organizations are 2%. The French don't go to church. They don't have as many of these organizations. And so the churches in France are big, elegant cathedrals, not the small black storefront kinds of churches, which are located in neighborhoods close to lower status African Americans. Nevertheless, the impact of the non-white population relates to these in different ways with okay, that's getting more complicated. Basically, if you have African Americans who embrace self-expression, then you don't have the kinds of crime rates which operate as we've shown elsewhere. Okay, so I gotta close this. Let's take questions. I'll leave this up for just a minute or two if there's anything you want to see in what I showed you here. Comments, questions? Someone had a Sharon, you said someone had a question. Do we have to read it, or is he here?
Luke is here, but Luke is in the library, so he typed his question in the chat section.
Okay, what's the question?
What is your perspective on drill music in a city like Chicago influencing fashionable youth?
Yeah, wait, a little slower and louder. What is your impression of what music?
Drill music. I'm not sure.
Okay, drill. I get you. Okay, drill rap. Yes, go ahead.
Drill music in a city like Chicago influencing impressionable youth. To what extent does this glorification of gang activity in music correlate with actual instances of violence?
Okay, now that's an excellent question. It's core to what if I had more, I have another session, and maybe I'll talk a bit about that and answer to that in the next day or two. Because that's a big question. It ties together the arts, culture, emotion, the gangs, the changing activities, and the police in powerful ways. So I won't try to give you a yes, no. I'll say it's complicated in ways that it's an excellent question, and it deserves elaboration. And if anybody wants to sort of read about it on your own, I'll pull some stuff together and answer it more seriously. Anybody else have a question you want to raise? What I have not done yet is, and I'm not going to do it in detail, is go over the readings. That is the readings in this section on ethnicity are classic and important, but I wanted to update them with some more current events, so you can see that these are connected. And that's what the video we saw on Bratton did very nicely, at the same time that we want to do with with Joseph Yee and Dahl and the Browning, Marshall, and Tapp. So take a look at those readings. But ask yourself why, what's the bigger point and how do these differ? How have these changed? Not that anything is wrong. There's nothing wrong in any of these, but the context change, such as Bratton pointed out, with the shooting of these individuals and national scandals heightened by Black Lives Matter and its activism. This in turn has heightened the focus on the police, and in ways that the police have then been generalized and even become the source of running for mayor or against mayor as a particular candidate. Charlotte, you usually have good questions.
Hi, I do have a question, actually. I don't think this is probably a great question, but you mentioned on the slideshow, you had selective attention, overstating weak relationships, this omitting critical variables, geographic scales, and add to the context of theories. Could you just go over like what that category is? I was having some tech issues and I missed that.
The one category or all of those together?
Like all of them together, what are they representing?
The point I'm making is what leads people to follow this normal story and what's wrong with the normal story. And I've got 5 or 6 points that show you why the normal story is both widely repeated as well as wrong. So instead of saying it's wrong, I'm trying to say you as analysts should try to bring these kinds of criteria, which I illustrate here. Not that I'm trying to say any person is wrong or any person is bad or any of this rhetoric is, I mean, it's obviously all rhetoric and it's got lots of emotion. I mean, huge emotions and policy ideologies are linked to this stuff. But I'm just trying to say that think about these kinds of criteria whenever you're talking about white racism or whatever else. So selective attention, overstating weak relations, omitting critical variables, then using big units that are too big. If you use a state or a metro area, you can get the opposite result if you use blocks. And this illustrates it most powerfully, surrounding Hyde Park. And how it can change. And so it's not as if this is goes back 1,000 years or 200 years or whatever. This changes in a year or two when the police change their beats. I mean, for instance, after I saw this map for 210, I rode my bike. I rode down to that brightest area just south of 55th Street, and I stood there for half an hour and took pictures of who was doing what. And there was a police car that went by about every 3 minutes. So the police knew this. When they saw this, they said, hey, we're gonna patrol that area. And I don't have a later number than that 2010, but the source for this is the Chicago police. They didn't release these data until recently. So they're releasing a lot of big data now so we can analyze things that you couldn't do in the 1920s or 30s. Okay, so those are the five kinds of points I'm making, which are, I'm glad you focused on them and said, what are these and why do we care? These are important criteria to think about when we talk about global and local. And then local in this case can mean the US, or it can mean one small block.
Thank you.
Okay, we are at the end of our time. We will continue Wednesday, and do send in email to me and our two TAs if you have things that you'd like to either discuss or encourage discussion of by others, and either I or others will look for ways to do so. Thank you, folks. We will have office hours right now for anybody who wants to stay on.